Good morning, buongiorno. Welcome. Welcome to one of the highlights of the festival, the panel talk with Gale and Hurd, moderated by Marcello Paolillo. Please welcome Gale and Hurd. Gale and Hurd is this year's recipient of the Raimondo Rezzonico Award. Gale has been so kind to join the festival in this situation that we all know, and we are again, and I want to express it again, extremely grateful for this, and I'm sure it's going to be an interesting conversation, not only for film buffs and fans, but especially for people in the film industry. Gale has been instrumental in creating the career of extremely important filmmakers. She has reshaped the way we perceive genres as science fiction, horror, and action, and has been extremely influential in creating and shaping the success of one of the most beloved horror TV series, such as The Walking Dead. But these are only the tips of the iceberg of Gale's career. There's so much more to be discovered, and I'm sure Marcello will ask the right questions in order for you to discover what Gale has accomplished in her wonderful career. And once again, Gale, thank you so much for being here with us, because you need to know, we invited Gale when the situation was not looking so bright as today, and she responded immediately and said, if it is possible, I will be there, and she never stepped back, and so it means the world, because you were the first person to say yes. And I'm saying this here publicly.
And how many did you ask before me?
This is an incredible... None.
I actually believe you. You seem like a truthful person.
None. The only person I asked is the publisher of a magazine that publishes Robert Kirkman's comic books, and I asked, how can I get in touch with Gale and Hurd?
They did tell me that. The first outreach that I had was through Skybound. Yeah.
But we didn't ask anyone before you. Because, look, quite honestly, for us it means the world to say that we can access the films and the creative minds behind the film. And for us it's very important. And being a fan of the work that you accomplished, it was important to go against the grain of the preconceived notions. And again, many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. I'm really happy that we have an hour to talk with Gale about all that she has accomplished, which is a lot. And so since we have some time, I would like to start from the beginning, the very beginning, because last night you said something very nice, which is cinema was your best babysitter. So I would like to know, how was that?
Well, what I wasn't able to say last night, because I didn't want to turn it into a long monologue. Everyone had had a very stressful evening. Is that even though there isn't nepotism involved, my mother and her 4 sisters grew up in Culver City, California. Culver City, California, back then was famous because of MGM Studios. They were very poor. They went to a Catholic school, and in order to defray the cost of their tuition, they started working at MGM Studios when they were 10. And the money that they made went to partially defray the costs of their Catholic education. And so my mother ultimately became the secretary to Jack Dawn, who was head of the makeup department. Another aunt worked in the story department. Another aunt was a script supervisor, and another aunt was an extra. And back then, there was no such thing as a stunt player. You were paid as an extra. And she doubled Louise Reiner in The Good Earth. And apparently she's in it more than Louise Reiner, and Louise Reiner won an Academy Award for her performance. There's a scene, I know this is not the topic, but I always think this is interesting for people to understand what influenced me were these stories from my relatives. And there's a scene in The Good Earth where the peasants rush into the granary because they're starving. And she was actually crushed under a metal plate and broke her ribs. She had no medical care. She had to pay for it herself. She received no salary. There were no benefits. And these are the kinds of things that actually started people pushing for a union. And she also doubled Merle Oberon in the Wuthering Heights. Anyway, so I heard these stories growing up, and so I was fascinated by the movie business. And my parents would drop me off at the Palm Canyon Theater in Palm Springs, and they had movies 4 or 5 hours a day for 10 cents. And as I said, that became my babysitter. And a lot of the movies that I saw were, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and a lot of genre projects. I think, and also musicals like Mary Poppins. And then, as I said, when I was older and able to drive, I would go to the drive-in theaters. Most people my age who went to the drive-in theaters went there to, make out and kiss with their partner. And I was like, no, I want to watch the movie. And that's the first time I saw a Roger Corman movie. Oh. Because they screened his Poe series. So I got to see all of the films in the Poe series that he had directed. And that was the only exposure I actually had to Roger Corman, because there was no internet back then. So I couldn't research him, because at that point there had been no books written about him.
And then we will get to the point when you actually started working with him. But I also read in an interview that you actually advise even a local library about the books that the youth should read. So I'm just wondering which kind of book you were advising, which were your readings back then. Were you already fascinated by genre, by sci-fi or horror? Or?
So one of my favorite authors, Ursula Le Guin, who wrote the Wizard of Earthsea series. There were a number of epic series in addition to Tolkien. And obviously they already had The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but there were a lot of, and I didn't think of it this way at the time, but a lot of women who wrote science fiction and fantasy novels who weren't stocked in the local libraries. So when I go back and look at some of the notes that I had from back then, I realized that subconsciously I tended to recommend a lot of women authors.
Interesting. And then you went to Stanford University. You studied economics and communication. So I'm wondering, was it there that you started to think, I want to be a producer, or that's something that came up later?
I didn't think about wanting to be a producer until my first interview at Roger Corman's. But I was studying economics at the Stanford campus in Britain, which was outside of London. And the program was run by Anthony Smith, still alive, CBE, who was at the time, the director of the British Film Institute, had co-founded Channel 4. And so we got to meet filmmakers. At that point, I really thought I was going to be an economist or maybe go to law school and become a lawyer. And then we had Basil Wright, and Basil Wright he started the National Film Board of Canada, which is really where the documentary art form began. And he worked there with John Grierson, and then came to the UK and started making famous documentaries about the Daily Mail, about not the newspaper, but the delivery of the mail, the real iconic foundations of documentary film. And I didn't realize you could actually study that and get a degree. So I added communications, which is where film and television is at Stanford, in my junior year. So I had to complete the entire program in 2 years.
And then after Stanford University, you did a job interview at the New World Pictures with Roger Corman. So I'm wondering how that went. How was your first interview with Corman?
Well, the interesting thing is that I was recommended to Corman by a former professor at Stanford, a gentleman by the name of Stephen Kovacs, who was a Czech filmmaker. Czech? No. Hungarian? No. Anyway, he was from Eastern Europe. I think it was Czech because they had been invaded by Russia, and his family escaped. Okay. And he taught film aesthetics. He taught some of the most compelling classes that I took. Roger hired him to be head of production, so the head of physical production. And then Roger asked him if there was anyone that he could recommend to possibly be his assistant. So he recommended me. I came down to Los Angeles. The first thing that Roger asked me, I thought I was going to be asked, how fast can you type? Because that's what secretaries did at the time. There was no word processing. So how fast can you type? You took notes back then in shorthand. I knew shorthand. We also back then used slide rulers. Slide rules, but and he said, "What do you want to do for a career?" Honestly, the one question that stumped me was that, because you thought about jobs back then, especially as a woman starting out. You didn't think about careers. This is going to go somewhere. This job is going to lead me to a future in the business. I thought, like my mother, I would be a secretary for life. But I had to think very quickly, and I thought, okay, Roger's been a director, he's been a writer, but now he's chosen to be a producer. I have a degree in economics, so I said producer. Honestly, not knowing at the time what a producer did, but it sounded financial.
But then, what also I thought was impressive is that then you work in pretty much all the different departments back then, and then at one point you were even head of marketing. But then you said that you decided to step back and just to become like a producer assistant just because you wanted to be on set.
Well, I was the marketing department. I didn't even have an assistant. Everyone that I worked with was freelance. No one taught me how to do the job. It was a very steep learning curve. I am not great at it, but at least I know now, which is so important for a producer, to know how to market your film. What are distributors looking for? What are audiences looking for? What images sell? What concepts sell? How do you describe a film in a couple of sentences? That was all what I learned at the time. But I made a deal with Roger because I thought, I'm going to suck at this, and he may fire me before I actually get to work on set. At this point, I'd visited set because I'd been a location manager, I'd been a number of other things, but it was always based in the office as opposed to with the production. And so I made a deal that he would find someone who was actually a professional in marketing, and he was going to have 6 months to do that, and I would be forced to do this job that I knew nothing about, and even when I did not very well, in 6 months. So I thought at that point that meant that I would become a producer because I'd run a department, even if I was the department. And so the 6 months were up, and he said, okay, you're going to go work on Humanoids from the Deep. That's my next movie. And I said, great, what's my title going to be? And he said, production assistant, which for all of you, probably know, is the lowest job on the production. I worked for everyone on the production. I couldn't say no to, regardless of what it was. Empty the chemical toilets in the motorhomes. which I always say is the most useful skill if there is a zombie apocalypse. So it could come in handy. And I worked in the props department, and I worked putting what we call super slime, methylcellulose, on Rob Bottin's creatures. So, and I learned about prosthetic makeup. I learned about so many things having assisted in those departments. And I prepared the call sheets for the next day's filming because the second assistant director, who normally does that, was dyslexic. And so they really couldn't tell if they were putting down the scene number correctly. It might be scene 13, they'd write 31, they couldn't really tell the difference. Or, as if that wasn't bad enough, if the actor's call time was supposed to be, 4:15 in the morning, they might write down, 5 p.m. I don't know. So
you had to double check.
So I did that too. Yeah.
And is this why because in interview you said you really don't understand how the producers that never go on set?
I don't. I mean, for a number of reasons. One, I think selfishly, it is where the magic happens. When you're on set and you're there with an entire crew, everyone pulling in the same direction. You've got the director interacting with the actors. You have the DP setting up the shots. I'm like a kid. I am like a child every time I go on a new set, because there's every film, every TV series has a different dynamic, and to be able to be a part of making that happen, as I said, that's where the magic happens.
And I'm wondering, because Roger Corman, besides being a legendary director, he also mentors some of the greatest directors of those days. Jonathan Demme, Francis Ford Coppola, Ron Howard, Joe Dante.
Martin Scorsese.
So it must have been an incredible environment back then. Do you have any particular memory?
They had all gone through by the time I started. However, you could call up any one of them, because it's almost like being part of a club. Former Roger Corman mentees. At the time Joe Dante was still working, he was cutting trailers. Yeah. John Davison was cutting trailers, working in, so I interacted primarily with Joe, with Louis Teague, and a few of the other directors whose careers Roger started.
And another thing that probably a lot of people don't know, because usually people associate immediately Corman to genre film, but New World Pictures actually released some of the greatest European and worldwide, like art house films, yes. Like from Ingmar Bergman to François Truffaut, from Federico Fellini to Kurosawa.
Volker Schlondorf.
Yeah, I read that in 10 years, they won more Oscars for Best Foreign Film than any other studio combined. So I'm wondering if that also you learn how to jump from big commercial film to independent films.
It was such a remarkable time, honestly, and I love foreign films to this day. And I got to be Francois Truffaut's driver in Los Angeles. I drove him around. I did not speak very good French, but it was, and from that time until his death, he sent me a personal Christmas card every year. I'm sorry, but it's just those kinds of things. Couldn't have happened anywhere else. And I also did the marketing for his film The Green Room, for Love on the Run. I did Ingmar Bergman's Autumn Sonata. There were remarkable films. And you had access to the filmmakers when they would come to the United States. So I do think that that's where I developed my passion and love for foreign films.
And from us European, we have almost this romantic idea of those periods, because you had the big Hollywood studios, but also the explosion of independent cinema. I don't know if in reality was that romantic of a picture, but what I'm wondering is that nowadays that the streamer have come and have taken over both studios and independent world. From your perspective, since you lived also that world, what is your take on that?
Well, I'd like to think that they can coexist. I think there's been a perfect storm, much like we had last night, where the pandemic has challenged a business that was already in difficult straits, and people got used to watching films on their devices, big films, little films, personal films, you name it. And I am hoping and praying that the cinema experience survives, not only for the big blockbusters, but for independent cinema, for foreign language films. I have served in the Foreign Language Committee at the Motion Picture Academy. And in fact, anyone at as a member of the Motion Picture Academy can participate in the early rounds. And I loved driving to the Motion Picture Academy, the Samuel Goldwyn Theater, watching foreign language films, intimate foreign language films, epic foreign language films, in a full cinema with other moviegoers, and there's nothing that replaces that.
And thinking about changes, of course, we in the past few years, between the Me Too scandal, the Black Lives Matter, of course, there's been so many changes. And this year we had an Oscar and a Palme d'Or to a woman director. I'm wondering, are you optimistic about this change? Do you think this is something that is going to last?
I think that the first step is always awareness that there's an issue, acceptance that something needs to be done about it, and overcoming resistance, because the momentum has always been with the status quo. It's not broken, don't fix it. But I think now some of the risks that studios and networks have been taking, having women directing bigger films, having more women direct on TV series, getting the opportunity to do something outside of what was considered a woman's picture, and more intimate drama, which I love as well, but people should not have their options restricted because of perception. Some of them have worked out really, really well. I mean, Patty Jenkins and Wonder Woman, and once again, telling a super heroine story, starring at that point unknown actress, at least in the United States, paid off very, very well. And I think so. We're going to see more of that. It's always a challenge when you're changing the status quo, that if someone blows their chance, let's say a woman directs a $200 million film and it doesn't do well, then it tends to not only impact that particular filmmaker, but women overall, as a gender. Same thing with people of color. But having Moonlight win the Oscar, having Black Panther do so well, I think there's greater acceptance, and with greater acceptance comes greater opportunity.
You said that in Roger Corman was a great exception because women there were very valued and respected. But I'm wondering.
Well, that's because we worked harder for less money.
Okay. But then when you decided to move on your own, and then we had to deal with the studios, I'm wondering how hard was back then to be valued and considered as a woman in that field. Because I read an interview actually heard an interview, and you said something that really stuck with me. You said back then you had to make a choice. You could either be liked or respected. You couldn't be both.
Yes,
do you think
absolutely.
it's still valued nowadays?
Do I think it's
Do you think it's still valid nowadays?
Oh yes, I do. I think there is still a box within a woman within which a woman is perceived. So, if you cry, you're emotional. If you lose your temper, you're hysterical and emotional. Men can scream and yell and go on and on. I'll never forget. I mean, it would happen today as well, when there was a front of a magazine of Dawn Steele, who, by the way, I worked with very closely and was a mentor of mine, calling her the Queen of Mean. And, you know, and yet they weren't calling out any male executives or producers or anyone else. And I think that's still the case today, is that, you know, you're judged in a different standard. And I think it's because socioculturally we've been raised with certain expectations about how women should behave and how men should behave, and you know, and so I realized if you go back and look at my high school yearbook, I don't know if you have those here, but people write little things. Your friends from high school write little comments, little notes. Every one of them said, "You were always so nice. You never got credit for anything you did. And you know, you were kind of treated like a doormat." But I was raised to believe that you always volunteered for things. Sheryl Sandberg in Lean In calls it the tall poppy syndrome. It's that you don't want to be the tall poppy. Well, I decided I was going to be the tall poppy. I was going to be the one that if someone said, "Okay, well, we're just going to pay you this," and they expected you would say, "Oh, thank you. Oh, that's so wonderful." And you realize it was a tenth of what an aspiring male producer who'd never produced anything was getting, that you pushed back. And God bless her, so did Sigourney Weaver on Aliens. She pushed back and said no until they paid her $1 million, which was more than any woman had been paid at the time. You know, and you know, now we're seeing, you know, all of a sudden Scarlett Johansson being paid $20 million is somehow, oh my God, what a surprise. So I think that proves the point.
And I'm curious, what's your take on the Bechdel test? For people who don't know, Bechdel test is a test that is a three-step measure of the representation of women in fiction. So they go through the scripts and the film, and in order to pass the test, you need to have at least 2 named women in a film talking. This is the first step. The second, there needs to be at least a scene in which they talk to each other. And the third step is that they need to talk about something other than a man. And for the record, I did some research, and most of your film actually passed all the 3 tests. The Terminator, Aliens, The Abyss, Dick, Aeon Flux, and even Tremors passed all 3 steps. So I'm wondering what is it, did you pay that kind of attention when you did
I didn't even, I mean, to be honest, I thought it was interesting because to have some sort of metric is worthwhile. Then you can start accumulating data and see if there is some sort of bias that puts women in a particular box. But obviously I didn't know about the Bechdel test at the time. I think that most Walking Dead, I would say probably all Walking Dead episodes pass the test as well, and Fear and the other TV series that I've done. But you know, often when you get notes from studio executives, I can't say about now, but it used to be that it was, we need the women to be softer and more relatable. No one's going to like her, and that became something that influenced generations of filmmakers, and also the roles of actors. Yet you go back and you look at the strong women from the films from the 40s, and I guarantee you a lot of films from the 40s would have passed the Bechdel test as well. And then I think we started backsliding, and you know, after that.
Which brings me to 1984, The Terminator, when you have like a very strong female lead. Even though it's called The Terminator, the actual lead is Sarah Connor. So, and then you did Aliens also that had a very strong female lead. So, but back to The Terminator, I believe you met James Cameron while you were working with Roger Corman. I think you were like a supervisor, effects supervisor, and he was doing miniatures?
I was the assistant production manager, so that meant I had responsibility for a lot of things. All of the things that the production manager did not want to be responsible for, which is all the areas in which the problems would arise. So I was the one who was thrown to the lions. But that was great. It was absolutely great experience. So the first time I met Jim, I went into the miniature shop where they were building the spaceship models. And it was supposed to be a surprise visit, but I guess they'd heard that Roger was sending his assistant over, so they were supposed to be on the lookout for me, and I was a spy. And I walk into the model shop, and lots of toxic smells because it wasn't well ventilated, and we know now that that kind of glue is dangerous. Anyway, but so I walk in, and this tall, blonde gentleman says, "Oh, you must be. Were you sent here to look at the status of the model shop?" And I said, "Yes, I'm Gale." And he said, "I'm Jim. Let me show you around." I went back and reported, and was very impressed, by the way, and reported to Roger that the model shop was in great hands under Jim Cameron. And he's like, "Who's Jim Cameron? He's not the head of the model shop." Well, he acted like it. He became it. And in addition to that, when the art director for the film didn't work out, because it was the biggest film he'd ever made, Battle Beyond the Stars, script by John Sayles, he decided he needed someone from the studio system, not one of us kids. So he hired someone. Well, it turned out in the studio system, you hire draft persons who draw things, who can do blueprints, who can do set design. Well, this guy had always had an entire staff do that, and he couldn't draw. So we were only a few weeks out from production. There were 25 sets that needed to be designed and built. None of them had been designed. None of them had drawings. But the good news was that the model shop had designed and built the exterior of all of them, inspired by the different aliens and where they came from, what they looked like, all of that. So Roger said, "What do you think we should do?" And I said, I know this is crazy, but I think you should hire Jim Cameron to be the art director." "Well, has he ever done it before?" "No. But I've never done this job before. A lot of the people that you work with have never done their jobs before." And overnight, Jim not only became the art director, he became the optical supervisor for visual effects and a visual effects cameraman, because he had wrote and directed, and was the DP and the visual effects supervisor for a very short film that I recommend that you all try to find, called Xenogenesis. And a lot of the films that he's done since came out of that short film, just as George Lucas's first film inspired a lot of things that he did in the future. And Roger looked at that and said, "Okay." And we ended up being able to get all the sets designed and built prior to filming. Although we kept having to tell the actors, "Don't touch the paint, it's still wet."
And then you went on producing your first film. He did Piranha 2, and then I heard that the beginning of Terminator was when he called you from Rome, saying that he had a dream about an alien coming out of flames.
Not an alien.
Cyborg. A cyborg.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, he did. He was very sick, very sick. He had a fever dream. He had a very high fever, and he had this fever dream of the Terminator endoskeleton coming out of the fire. And from that seminal image came the entire story, script of the Terminator. And we would talk back and forth on the phone while he was in Rome, where the Italian-Greek producer was trying to get rid of him and get him to go back to the United States. And Jim is not a quitter. Jim would not leave. So.
And I'm wondering, because back then, was it a difficult sell that film? Because, you know, in the early 80s, it was all about the success of technology. I mean, it's much more timely nowadays, probably.
Well, I think that we had a number of strikes against us. First of all, Piranha 2 was not a success at the box office or critically. I was a woman producer. Yes, I'd produced a film before. It only cost $280,000, and I produced it for Roger Corman. And we'd had no exposure to the major studios. So the first person we took the Terminator script to was Roger. And God bless him, he said, "You're not going to want to make this movie for the budget I'm going to give you." But he didn't say no. So we actually didn't get a first no. We got you need to go someplace else, which was just as difficult as a no. But luckily, so we went to the studios. Every one of them said no. And in fact, they not only said no, they said, "This is awful, this is stupid, and, you know, don't bring us any more of your crappy stories," which is really, really difficult. But our first yes, surprisingly, was from HBO. There was a woman at HBO who read the script and said, HBO will buy the rights for, it's hard to believe HBO has been around that long, but for $500,000, which was huge. And so that was the first commitment we had. But the budget, including bond and completion, the bond and contingency was $6.4 million. So we were a long way off.
It's still almost like an independent film compared to the studio
Yes.
movies.
But anyway, so I'll compact the story. So Barbara Boyle, who had been one of my mentors working for Roger Corman, had gone to work for Mike Medavoy, also recipient of the award I received last night. And he said, "Okay, I'm very interested in this. Let me talk to Orion International, a gentleman by the name of Ernst Goldschmidt." Ernst Goldschmidt said, "We're in. Orion International is in." And they said, "But you need to raise at least half of the budget elsewhere." And then I went out trying to raise the rest of the budget. At least 99 people said no. And then very quickly, I had heard that there was a company called Hemdale that had an output deal with Orion, and they needed another picture to fill a slot. And they needed it within a certain period of time. So I thought, oh my God, I've got to get to them. And phone call after phone call, not returned. And the gentleman who was head of development, Barry Plumley, was selling a desk. So I thought, he'll return my phone call if I say I'm interested in buying the desk. And that's exactly what happened. He returned my phone call. I bought the desk. He read the script. The Terminator got made.
And
it was a $400 desk. It was the best $400 investment I ever made.
And I read you studied production in March, but you had to release it in October. That seems like
no time at all, especially when you consider visual effects back then. There were, no CGI. The Terminator, the stop motion armature had to be all of that had to be choreographed, which, by the way, was done by a gentleman by the name of Peter Kleinow, who I think did an amazing job. Who, for any of you who are music fans here, he was part of a seminal band. He played slide guitar for the Flying Burrito Brothers. So he did both. So by day he'd be animating the Terminator. By night he'd be playing slide guitar on stage.
and then 1986, Aliens. So, and that was another set of challenge because, you know, the first film was so iconic. So I think there was a huge pressure to go and, you know, and try to make a great film out of a great property, like a great sequel, which actually Aliens was, of all the franchise, the one that got more Oscar nomination and wins.
Well, you also have to go back and imagine 1985 and actually 1984, because that's when Jim first had the meeting to discuss writing a script. But it wasn't even Aliens at the time. Anyway, you can read all of that about how that came to pass. But sequels were not heralded or in fashion the way they are now. In fact, people always, their perception was that the second movie should be made for less money than the first because it'll only make maybe 60% of the box office. And so huge credit to the producers of the film, the executive producers, Walter Hill, David Geiler, and Gordon Carroll. Everyone at Fox, there were 3 different administrations at Fox during the time that Jim started writing the script up until we released the film. And you know, and they believed in it, but there were a lot of speed bumps along the way, including Sigourney saying, "I want $1 million to come back," and Fox saying, "Write her out of the script. Tell a different story." And Jim and I said no.
Interesting. And she actually was, I believe, was the first Academy Award nomination for an actress in an action movie, which says a lot about the quality of the script and
Yes.
of the film.
Yeah, we woke up that morning, Oscar nominations morning. We had 7 Oscar nominations. It was really, that was the most surreal morning of my life.
And I'm wondering, Ridley Scott had very nice words about Aliens, but I'm wondering, did you ever get in touch with him before or after?
You know, we actually met him briefly at Pinewood Studios when we were filming, and he basically said, make your own movie, make it your own, which was very freeing. And it was because we were such huge fans of Alien. We didn't want to make more of a sort of gothic contained horror film. We wanted to make a combat film, an action film. And that was a very deliberate decision not to try to do a remake of something that I don't think you can make any better than Ridley Scott already did.
And I heard it was not easy, the shooting, because to put it lightly, because I think there was a lot of resistance from part of the crew was from the first film, and was there any resistance because of American producer, because you were a woman producer, or?
It was, yes, I had a lot of resistance. Jim had a lot on his plate, and I would take all the first interviews with all the possible heads of department, and many of them would say, why am I meeting with you, who's really producing the movie? I was literally the producer. It's not like now where you see like 10 names as producer and you wonder who does what. I was the producer. And then they, you know, they'd say, sorry, you know, when do I get to meet Jim? And they're like, and I said, you just told me you won't take any kind of instruction or orders or anything else from a woman, so you won't be coming back to meet Jim. And then they would call 20th Century Fox and say, who is this rude young girl who's, you know, talking to me like that? And thank God they backed me up, and they said, she's the producer and you're not working on the movie. But then we had an assistant director, may he rest in peace, Derek Cracknell. And Derek Cracknell had directed a movie. And he had directed it was a science fiction movie. He thought, and he might have worked on the first film, I'm not sure. He thought he should be directing the movie. Why did they bring in these people from America to take over a British franchise like this? And it's such an important one. And so he was constantly going behind us and rabble-rousing, and he would roll his eyes and say, the governor wants this, he wants you to do this. And I remember once it was Sigourney's big scene. It was her big close-up after with the little girl when she's, cross my heart and hope to die. I'll keep you safe, right? I won't let you die. The entire crew left because there was a crew screening in London of Revolution. I think it was Hugh Hudson movie, anyway, whoever directed it. They wouldn't do her scene. They wouldn't do her close-up. She had to come back the next day. I mean, when you're a really great actor, you're working up in the wide shot, all of that, to a performance in the close-up. She had to do it the next day. So anyway, we really lost her at that point. So Derek Cracknell got the crew to strike the next day, and they refused to film. So we literally had to have a town hall meeting, and we couldn't replace Derek, but we managed to get past that, finish the movie. Although everyone kept calling Jim the Yank, and he is a Canadian. He never became a U.S. citizen, and that may have galled him more than anything else that the British crew was calling him a Yank.
And next door, not next door, but in a nearby location, they were shooting Full Metal Jacket, I believe. So I wonder, did you ever meet Stanley Kubrick?
I literally was and remain such a fan of Stanley Kubrick that when he would come into the dining room and at Pinewood, I was like, I couldn't look at him. When he'd be seated, I could look at him, but I know Jim got to meet him and speak with him. I was too intimidated. I wish I hadn't been, because that would have been a treasured memory.
Because I think you said that 2001 is your
Yes.
favorite film.
Yeah. I mean, 2001 is where it became a game changer for science fiction genre. It was the first A movie directed by an esteemed director, where people, critics and fans started taking, well, fans I think already did, taking science fiction as an actual art form of a genre, not just a B movie genre.
And it's probably one of the most experimental, biggest experimental film, which brings me to a question, because you've done so many sci-fi film in which you had to experiment with technology. People sometimes don't consider that. You had to literally experiment technology, and you couldn't know before. You had huge budget, but you couldn't know before how that would turn out, like with the CGI, for example, in Abyss and T2. And so how do you manage that to try to you create this huge production and you still have to experiment technology that was never...
Well, you try to experiment on something else first. So I remember I did a movie called Alien Nation with Mandy Patinkin and Jimmy Caan, and we shot that in Super 35 because we were thinking about using Super 35 for I think for another film, maybe The Abyss, and then Jim knew that he wanted to ultimately, actually he didn't realize he was going to direct it, but make Terminator 2. So The Abyss was one of the first 3D CGI characters ever created by ILM. And Dennis Murin, the multiple Academy Award winning visual effects supervisor, took a year off to study computers and algorithms and learn how to do something entirely different that he had no training for prior to that. And I also remember that that the late Sid Mead, who designed the spacecraft in Aliens, it's called PFM Drive. That's what the Sulaco has to travel through space. And so we asked him, you had this drawing that says PFM Drive. What does that mean? And he said, pure fucking magic. So you trust the people that you partner with, and if they say they can do it, if Dennis Murin says, I can do this, you trust them, and then you lie to the studio. So when they said, well, how are you going to do this? I said, oh, it's simple. Don't worry about this water snake. Don't worry, that's going to be easy. And then they'd look at dailies, and we'd have this gray like tubing, so that we could film, so that they could match it, sort of like portable air conditioning. You know, they have that flexible tubing. You'd see grips with that in the scene, and they'd look at it and they go, what is this? Because they're like, that looks awful. It's like, it's not going to look like that at the very end. But that was actually the hardest part, was when they started looking at dailies and thinking we didn't know what we were doing and that it was going to be a huge $40 million boondoggle.
And speaking of the abyss, is it safe to say that was the most difficult shooting?
Well, I mean, with Jim, for Jim it was the Titanic, but for me, yes, it was the abyss. We had T-shirts made that says, you know, life's abyss, and then you dive, because try filming mostly underwater sequences in a filming tank that was never meant as a filming tank, that was an uncompleted nuclear power. Wow. Yeah, it was where the nuclear rods were actually they never finished it, so they were never in it. But still, it didn't hold water. We had to come up with a filtration system. And I mean, I felt like I was the producer of you know, a very large infrastructure project, because that's what it was. In addition to making the movie, you had to create the facility itself in which you can film. And
did you pick up this film, did you research this film also because you are also, I think, a big fan of scuba diving? Did it came after that? Or?
Oh, yeah. Jim wisely said, you can't produce this movie unless you're a certified scuba diver. And I am very claustrophobic. I failed 3 scuba diving courses. When I finally passed, it was such a sense of accomplishment that I became passionate about it and started a scuba diving business in Micronesia, which, if you haven't been there, is some of the best scuba diving in the world. I don't own it anymore, so.
And then 1990, you did, after this big muscular film, then you did Tremors, which became a cult following. Now it has a cult following, but back then, I believe it was one of the lowest rating films.
When we screened it, you know, they call them market research screenings. What it really is, you know, is a way to destroy filmmakers. They give cards to people, and what I realized, and I should have known, because I would do this for Roger Corman, I didn't know there is a recruiting paragraph to get people to come see the movie. And they said it was going to be a horror film from the producer of Aliens. Well, Tremors bears almost nothing in common with Aliens, and it's a comedy. So people came to that screening expecting to be scared to death, not realizing that they're supposed to laugh, that it's a comedy, and thinking that we had really failed to make a scary movie when it was never intended to be a really scary movie. And so the cards reflected that. It was, to this day, I remember, it was a 45 in what they call the top 2 boxes, excellent, very good. And I think standard is maybe the lowest would be 65. So we were 20 points below. And at that point, Universal kind of decided that they were not going to put much marketing money into the film.
And then, since then, I want to open up the floor if there is any question. We don't have, we still have, I think, 10, 15 minutes. So, but before we go to The Walking Dead and TV series, then I would like to address also your career as an independent producer, because you know you are very well known, of course, for these big films, but you've also done a lot of outstanding documentaries and a lot of award-winning films that you want
that no one's heard of. But
right, you won a Sundance.
Sure. I mean, one of the first independent films I did was about $2 million, called The Water Dance, and it won the Audience Award and Best Screenwriting Award at Sundance. And even more hilariously, a movie you've never heard of won for the director, Neil Jimenez. It's a semi-autobiographical story of him falling off a cliff and becoming paraplegic while he was a directing student at UCLA. Anyway, so it won at the Spirit Awards, the Independent Spirit Awards. It won Best First Feature over Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs. Little known story. And Neil, sadly, because of his disability, we took a chance with him as director, but he never directed again. So who knows? He could very well have gone on to a tremendous career. So anyway, so that one, and then the documentaries. I've done 3 documentaries about Native Americans. The most recent was Mankiller, about Wilma Mankiller, the late Wilma Mankiller, the first woman elected principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And I am currently in post-production on working with Alex Winter, who directed films about blockchain, Napster, Panama Papers, and most recently Frank Zappa, called Mass Effect: The Rise of YouTube. So that has been financed entirely independently as well.
And before we go to The Walking Dead, in 1998, of course, you had a huge success, which was Armageddon. But wondering, that had another set of difficulties, because there was literally a race with Deep Impact that was coming out that is almost at the same time. And the year
By
before,
the way, that's happened 3 times to me.
Yeah, because also with Dante's Peak, you had
With Dante's Peak, it
Volcano.
was Volcano, and with The Abyss, there were 2 other movies, Leviathan and Deep Star 6.
So how stressful is that?
Whole different level of stress, because the studio's pushing you. With Dante's Peak, we finished shooting in October and we're out in February with a huge visual effects film. And honestly, I mean, people's health was affected. It was brutal.
And Armageddon got a Criterion edition as well. So I'm wondering, what is your relationship with critics?
What is my relationship with critics?
Did you read reviews? Do you?
My friends tell me whether I should read reviews or not. Because you have to, if there are a number of positive ones and you go, oh, it's great, they get the movie. Well, if they then criticize another movie, it's like they haven't changed, Maybe you can always learn something from criticism. You may not always agree with it, but you can always learn something. Anything that is too laudatory, that's hard to take. The funny thing is that Pauline Kael, the late Pauline Kael, once wrote that the most feedback that she had that was negative and criticized her was when she negatively reviewed Aliens.
And then I would like to talk a bit about the Walking Dead franchise, because it's a massive franchise, but I think you had to resurrect it because nobody wanted to do it. I mean, Frank Darabont had been trying to do it and nothing happened. But then you decided to pick it up and to make it. And I'm wondering, how did you convince AMC, which was known for Mad Men, to produce right away like 6 episodes of a zombie apocalypse?
Well, first of all, in television, producers are used to, you have a development season, you take something out, it doesn't sell, you move on, you forget about it. Feature film producer, you're used to not giving up on things, because if someone doesn't buy it this year, maybe they'll buy it next year or in 2 years. So it's a different mindset. So you don't give up on things and you don't take no for an answer. And I was very lucky because AMC had reached out to my company and said, we're looking for elevated genre, which was as much a surprise to me as it was certainly to you and everyone else, because I knew AMC, which stood at the time for American Movie Classics. So they played a lot of my favorite movies. They had Mad Men, which was perfect for that audience. But their most successful block of programming that had the highest ratings for them was called Fear Fest, which was the 2 weeks leading up to Halloween. and that's where they played classic science fiction and horror films. They wanted to launch a new series when they had those viewers as an audience. And so we, first I had to talk Frank Darabont into going back and resurrecting it, and then we had to talk Robert Kirkman into trusting us again. And then actually we pitched. They said yes, but they had a co-financier which is, since the Fox Disney thing, I'm not sure how it exists, but the Fox International channels. And the Fox International channels said, we do not have a foreign paradigm in which you make a pilot. Because the US paradigm is you make a pilot, you test it, you see if people like it, and then you order more episodes. Well, they said, if we're going to put money in this, you have to make 6 episodes. So it was the perfect confluence of AMC being interested, Fox putting up so much of the budget, and insisting on 6 episodes.
And where do you feel more comfortable, either in film, where the director has much more power and is almost like
Well, in Europe, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, when I work with, first of all, it's a team. It's the producer and the director, when things are working well, have the same vision for the film. May have creative discussions, but will never show that there's any conflict in front of the crew, the studio, the financiers, the cast. But I have often had final cut beyond the director. When it's a first-time director or someone who doesn't have, the same resume that I do.
Right.
But which do I like? Both. I think they feed different. They feed different hunger that I have. And I consider a TV series a marathon storytelling, and feature filmmaking is a sprint.
And speaking of marathon, we are now at the 9th season of The Walking Dead. Which
11th.
one? Well,
We're in the 11th.
Okay, but
Yes.
the 9th one I think was released last year.
I
Was
think
one of the highest
10th.
rated.
I think
one.
10th. Anyway,
Okay.
I'm not going to argue with you.
Okay. No. You know better than
No,
me for sure.
it could be because we didn't stop filming. We stopped
Because
filming
of
for a
the-
short period,
because of
but
the
we stopped
COVID.
filming in May when the pandemic hit, but we started up again in October. So we've been filming almost continuously. So it's very hard because I'm obviously seeing many episodes into the 11th season. So
okay.
I could be wrong.
But I'm wondering, how do you keep that alive? Because the last one got huge ratings, and then you have at the same time 2 spin-off,
Yeah.
one that even intersects with the main one. And also, how do you keep all the writers' room, and how you are able to? It must be a massive.
Well, the person responsible for that I have to give all the credit to is Scott Gimple, who is the chief content officer of the Walking Dead universe. But we're in touch quite a bit. And we have great showrunners. I mean, Angela Kang has been running The Walking Dead for a number of years, and each of the shows is run by someone who cut their teeth as a writer on the original series. So we already have a shorthand with them. They understand the rules, they understand the canon, and they're all fans of the comic book, even though Fear the Walking Dead and Walking Dead World Beyond don't have, don't have their foundation in the comic book.
And speaking of the intersection between TV series and film, can you say something about the rumor about a Walking Dead film at Universal and an Aeon Flux TV series?
There's script being written now for the Walking Dead feature film, which, if and when it gets made and is a success, we have a story arc that goes for a couple of series, a couple of more movies, and Aeon Flux. I am hopeful and excited, but we don't have a green light yet.
Okay. Is there any question from the audience? Yes. Oh, if you want, you can. I don't know. Are you going to do it in English?
She speaks English.
Okay.
I know. We've met before.
Hi. I think my question is really about, pardon me, my question is really about content, more specifically about your relationship to content now, considering the frenzy that it is that we have with Netflix and Hulu and HBO, etc. As a filmmaker, has it made you approach your view of what it is that you look for any differently, considering that the market is so...
I don't know how to change
Okay.
the way that I look at what it is I want to do. I don't know how to do that. I'm not in, even though with all these Walking Dead shows, it seems like I'm in the volume business. I am not. I'm not in the volume business. I think it's important to have passion for what it is you do. You're not going to make the best version of anything if you're just looking at it like, you're feeding coal into the engine of a train. You need to believe in it. I have turned down projects that I thought were fantastic that people brought to me, and I said, I love this, but I'm not going to make it better. I'm not going to be added value to helping you bring this to the screen, whether it's the small screen, the big screen, or the streaming screen. And if you can't be additive, if you can't contribute, whether you're a writer, director, producer, actor, unless you have no choice but to take whatever is offered to you, and there were times in my life when that was the case, you have to turn it down.
First, I have to say that I grew up in Sherman Oaks and Palm Springs, and there was a theater in Studio City called the Lorena Theater. Where
Of course, are you kidding?
my parents snuck me there for the afternoon every weekend.
That was,
So
yes.
I'm fascinated. It was marvelous to hear that. But my question is, back
on
to
Ventura Boulevard, and it became a bookstore for a while.
Did it really?
Yeah.
That was later. But and my question is back to Roger Corman. I'm absolutely fascinated by that. Do you think that Roger Corman saw the talent, all these famous people that went through his studios? Did he see the talent in these people, or was this blind luck?
Well, you can look at a lot of other low-budget companies that were hiring directors at the time. I mean, a few, as we know, came out of Trauma and other. But yes, he absolutely has an eye. I mean, you can understand that based on his passion for foreign language films and the foreign language films that he picked up for distribution. So he understands filmmaking and filmmakers. He may not have been at the same level as the directors that he hired, but he accepted that. And I think the most remarkable thing about Roger is that once he realized that someone he'd worked with, and not everyone he hired was talented, he would push those directors, those producers, those writers, those actors to leave the comfort of Roger Corman and go out and have a huge career. I remember arguing with him about the Terminator, saying, no, we can make it for $2 million. He said, you won't make it well. You're going to have a huge career. You and Jim are going to have a huge career. And I'll be rooting for you. And exactly, most people are very possessive and like, I want to hitch my wagon to this horse. And that was never him. He never insisted. Even when asked if he would take an executive producer or producer credit on a film to help it get made, he said no.
Yes.
Hello, Kuriko from Japan, eiga.com. Nice to meet you. Just 2 days ago, I saw Dick.
Right.
That it's fantastic, and I'm so thrilled and enjoyed, and I think it's very very audacious script, it's mixing the Watergate, very political subject, and grown-up story of teenagers. So I guess again, that period it's very very difficult to make such type of movie, and this is comedy as well. So, do you remember some anecdote to making this
During
movie?
the production?
Yes.
Well, for those of you who didn't see the film, it really is. It's a delightful film about something as dark as Watergate, but it stars early on in their careers, Kirsten Dunst and Michelle Williams. Ryan Reynolds has a small part, and as I said that day, that is a film that is a testament to the contributions of a casting director, and they very rarely get mentioned. They are so important. If we had gotten that casting wrong, we could have had, and you also don't think of Kirsten Dunst necessarily, and certainly Michelle Williams as being comedic. And when they were 15, perfect comic timing. Let me see. Well, there was actually an anecdote when we showed the movie to the studio. So it was financed by Mike Medavoy's company, who also financed the Terminator. So that was another reason why I wanted to screen it. The Sony decided they would market it only to teenagers, and which teenagers are not going to understand necessarily the humor, because Watergate even then wasn't something that they had lived through, and they also put it out in summer. This is not a summer movie. This is a movie that needs to not be competing against the big blockbusters. So I think it only played in theaters for a couple of weeks. But we, on that film, Kirsten Dunst taught my daughter to do handstands in the pool. My daughter was 6. She's an extra on the lawn in front of the White House. And she also, Kirsten had her sweet 16th birthday party on the film, and there was a sense of joy and innocence, and because it was a comedy, it was so much fun. That was the antidote to a lot of the darker, bigger movies that require visual effects, that have special effects, that there is, as you remember, a very short car chase in it, so I did manage to get a car chase in it. But it was so much fun. And I'm so proud of it, even though it wasn't a huge success at the box office. But the Washington Post wrote 3 different articles on it. So it survived, at least in Washington.
Yes.
Hi, my question is about this Hollywood fate of making bigger and bigger movies. I would like to have your point of view on this, especially when it comes to James Cameron, because I think he's truly a man of visions, but he's also embarked, taken in this logic of making less and less movies, bigger and bigger ones. So how do you see that?
Well, I think that the machine that drives Hollywood now, the studios, to stay in business, have been the huge blockbusters. And the reason we're seeing sequels and remakes and comic book characters, and I admittedly have done all those, is because you've already got a built-in want to see, you've got a demand, you've got awareness, and you want to be able to incorporate as much scope as possible, to get people to leave home to go to the theater to see something that in their mind is worth leaving home for. And I haven't asked Jim, did you intend to make 3 sequels? I think At a certain point, they looked at the budget and felt that to amortize it, since they shot continuously, that it made more sense to financially and economically to make the multiple sequels at the same time. But you know, that's a burden I can't see shouldering myself. And you know, and it must be incredibly stressful to be one of those filmmakers. You know, we've seen the blowback against, you know, fans decide that they own the characters in the world and the storytelling. And I understand that, because without their passion, the films would not have achieved the success that they did. On the other hand, it's very constricting and restricting to filmmakers who want to reinterpret it, who want to do something new, because that defies maybe fan expectations, and there can be, you know, terrible blowback for doing that. So more power to the people who take it on, and let's hope they're all received with the same level of passion that the filmmakers, you know, have put into making them.
We have time. I don't know if there's any other question. Otherwise, we need to close. Okay, just the last question there.
Perhaps it's a funny question, but how would you differentiate the scientific part with the now perhaps coming virtual reality part, which perhaps is a big issue in that people in, I don't know, 20 years have just glasses on. They see not movies, but virtual realities, which are in reality movies, but under another title.
You know, I am not a big gamer, but I think the gaming industry is more successful than the entertainment industry, from my understanding. So clearly, I'm behind the times and not current on that. But people, you know, the new audience is finding a great deal of entertainment in the gaming world, and the virtual gaming, and I think that's merging, just as you said. You know, it's everyone is afraid when there's a new technology that's introduced. You know, radio was terrified of television. And so was feature films, and then we were all afraid of home video, and then streaming, and yet now we have a content explosion, as you point out, that rivals and perhaps exceeds when everyone was making films around the world. And sadly, we've lost a lot of them because they were on silver nitrate and they no longer exist. But we're seeing a content explosion, and you know, and the thing is, hopefully there will be storytellers in that medium who are as powerful, and I'm sure there will be, as the storytellers we've had going back to the very beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gale, for being here with us, and congratulations.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for asking, all of you, for asking such great questions. I can't, I'm sorry. I'm late. I've got a 6.5-hour drive ahead of me, but thank you. In fact, we were supposed to leave at 11:45.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you so much.